We are now going to go from community to Hollywood. And we like to think that we have good ideas, but these conferences demonstrate how people actually have different ideas on dealing with Hollywood. And the main issue today that our moderator will lead us in a discussion is, do we cancel shows or do we collaborate on shows, or is there a mixture or combination thereof? There are different opinions, and again, we're very proud that we're going to have different points of views on these issues. And leading us in that discussion is our Hollywood liaison, Deana Nassar, who's done a lot of work, especially in our media awards, along with Suhad Ubaidi and the chairman of the Hollywood Bureau for MPAC, Ahmos, Hassan, who's one of our panelists here. And does Hollywood listen? I think that's another question we have to ask. And how do we make Hollywood listen? There's so many communities who feel they're outside the margins of filmmaking, and they all have their different methods and models in engaging Hollywood. So, do we promote more collaboration on it, or do we just try to cancel the bad stuff that's within Hollywood today? So, with that, I'd like to leave it off with our distinguished member of our staff who works in the Hollywood Bureau, Deana Nassar. Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me? Let's try this again. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch and that you're nice and full, and that the cheerleaders didn't make the lines too long for you. So we just finished a very real and serious conversation about our internal issues as a community, and we're going to shift gears just a bit. With this conversation, we're going to look at public perception, and particularly Hollywood. So I have three very wonderful guests that I'm very excited to have a conversation with today about the issue of image making, and as Salam said, how do we interact with Hollywood when it comes to the image of Islam and Muslims? I'm going to first start by introducing our panelists. Their bios are all in the program book, so I'm not going to spend too much time on their bios. To the very left of me, I have Zahra Billoo, who is the Executive Director of the CAIR office in San Francisco Bay Area. So please welcome her. Next to Zahra, I have Ahmos Hassan, who, as Salam mentioned, is the board chairman of the Hollywood Bureau, and he is a producer and manager in Hollywood. And sitting next to me, I have Peter Sattler, who is a writer and director. He just recently released a feature film called Camp X-Ray, which is about Guantanamo Bay, and we'll be getting more into that later. Please welcome Peter. Okay, so when I started thinking about preparing for this conversation, I realized a couple of things. One, there is a lot to unpack with this topic, because I think for Muslims and Arabs and South Asians, I think Hollywood has been talking about us for a long time, but we haven't been talking about Hollywood for a long time. So there's a little bit of I want to organize the conversation a little bit so that for those of us who have been thinking about these issues more on a regular basis, we're not jumping ahead in the conversation. So I'm going to start with the image making. And I want us to talk a little bit about, first, what is our challenge in Hollywood? Why should we care? What are we even talking about, right? And then, after we kind of establish that, I want to move into more strategic and tactical questions about what are we trying to accomplish, and then how do we even begin to accomplish these things. So we're all on the same page? And this is, as with the first panel, this is going to be a conversation amongst us. The audience, I'm going to open it up to questions around the last third of the hour. So start thinking about your questions. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question for everybody. Most of us are familiar with Jack Shaheen's research on the perception of Arabs in the media, dating back to Rudolph Valentino and the portrayal of the Arab Sheik. And we know that historically Hollywood has had a Muslim problem, whether it's been the portrayal of the terrorists or the submissive woman or the Arab Sheik who the billionaire Saudi, the tropes are plenty and we're very intimately familiar with them. My first question, just to start off, is from your guys' perspective, do you think that Hollywood is getting better or worse at how they portray Islam and Muslims? And let's popcorn it, see who wants to start.
I guess I'll jump in. I would say it's getting better, and the only reason I say that is because there's more opportunity to tell the story, or to tell reality, or to give reality. If you were somehow able to block out the news media and what's happening in that question, and just go into Hollywood itself, which is a creator of content, then I would definitely say it's getting better. And it's certainly not getting better fast enough. We would prefer it all to be faster, but in my opinion, it's getting better.
I think my first reaction to the question is that in addition to the Muslim problem, it's important to acknowledge that Hollywood has lots of problems, right? So a lot of the negative portrayals of Muslims that we feel were impacted by African American communities are impacted by other problems, the LGBT community, the Asian American community. So really broadening the experience is a first reaction for me. And then I would agree with Ahmos that it feels like it's getting better. And maybe we'll talk more in strategies about why, but engaged communities is one reason I attribute that to.
I think I would agree. My perspective on it is I feel like Hollywood is able to maybe approach and shift some of these tropes in. I don't think they can do everything at once. I think that they've been kind of ticking them off one by one. If you look at it over the past 50 or 100 years, you start with like civil rights, and it's like, okay, well, let's just do that. Let's just maybe change how we treat African Americans in films. And then a little bit later, okay, now we're going to maybe deal with women. Most recently, you look at the kind of the title shift in how homosexuals are treated and the kind of normalization of that and how that has really been adjusted as well. So my perspective in it is I feel like with Muslims or the Arab world, I feel like that is like the new wave that's just starting. And maybe that's just because I've been involved in the film and with you all, but like I feel like that's starting to really adjust, especially having so much distance from 9/11, which unfortunately was such a knee-jerk reaction to it for so many people. I feel like now everyone's starting to come out of that and starting to look at things in a more honest way. And I feel like hopefully that's potentially going to be the next wave of normalization, to be like, look, these are, this is an everyday thing. We can start to portray these things in a more honest and less stereotypical way.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it does come in waves, and as Zahra mentioned, we have to be cognizant of the larger community that gets mistreated and mischaracterized. When I was researching this topic, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read Chris Rock's essay that he penned for The Hollywood Reporter, I think last week, in part of his promotion for a new movie that's coming out that he's directing. And he's been talking a lot lately about roles and opportunities for African American men and women in Hollywood. And you know, the example that he cited in his essay was that, you know, the sort of popular thing is like when you hear in the rumor mill in Hollywood that a new role is coming out, a new romantic comedy or action film or you know, thriller is coming out, and they're starting to talk, there's the buzz about who's gonna play the lead. He says it's never gonna be, oh, is it gonna be Ryan Gosling or Chiwetel Ejiofor? Like, it's not gonna be that. It's gonna be Ryan Gosling and Christian Bale, or Ryan Gosling and, you know, some other white actor. So I kind of have two parts to this question. One is, we do see that the African American community, the Latino community, the LGBT community has made strides that we have not yet made as a Muslim, and I'd say specifically indigenous or immigrant Muslim population. I guess the way I want to tackle this question is, what do you attribute the limited but still, I think, inspiring success that many other communities have achieved? What do you attribute it to? And what also, like, what do you have any thoughts on what are the continual barriers that they might face that relates to the problems we face?
Well, I think that there are really two things there that you speak of, and I'll address the second part, which, what are the barriers? It's the barriers as there are in any other area in our country, and it's the competing agendas, and there are agendas that will get in the way of these different groups progressing on screen, and those agendas will slowly go away. And if you're lucky, if you're a lucky group, you have a powerful agenda that actually pushes the other way and pushes you forward faster than you might normally. But in essence, the way human beings interact with different groups is, especially in Hollywood, it's an organism. It's growing, it then grows other parts, and it lives through parts and dies. You know, there's no way to predict, but ultimately it's a reflection of life. And the groups that are evolving in whatever is happening in life is going to be reflected on screen. And it'll go through a period of inaccuracy, which is just simply a form of ignorance on who is creating the content, to the point where it gets more accurate and then becomes as real as possible. And as long as it's economically viable, it will continue to be on screen.
Okay, so the question of economic viability, I also then want to bring in this issue of funding and financing, because, I mean, it's fascinating that we're having this conversation at this time, because there have been a number of articles addressing this very issue, and controversies coming up in Hollywood, so it's timely. I don't know, I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with the film Exodus that's going to be coming out in the next few weeks. It's basically the story of Moses, and as we know, it takes place in Egypt, and the controversy around it is that most of the leading casts are white, European descendants. And on top of that, there's been a lot of people who've been offended by it, because some of the more demeaning roles, the slaves and the thieves and the lower class people are being cast by African Americans. So I mean, we can all imagine the optics. And for many reasons, we can talk about why there are many problems with those decisions. Ridley Scott, who produced the film, addressed the issue of casting and the lack of diversity, and he was very candid. He said he couldn't have made such a big budget movie if my lead actor is, quote, Muhammad so-and-so from such and such. I'm just not going to get it financed. So the question doesn't even come up. And I think the part that bothered me the most was the last part about the question doesn't even come up. Like there's just no, there's nobody who is going to advocate for the story being told in any kind of authentic or rooted way. So just to add to this question, because finance, we can't talk about bias in Hollywood without talking about the money, right? They go hand in hand. I guess my question is, do you buy that? Do you buy that argument? How real is that argument? Peter, I know that you
It's completely
financed.
real. This is, to me, this is the crux of all these conversations, which I always get stuck in the middle of because I can see two very distinct and absolute realities, which is, the reality is, yes, like there should be, like the diversity is a huge problem in Hollywood and in media in general. But there is I can put myself in the mindset of a studio or a financier. These people are I mean, at the very upper levels. I mean, you have to keep in mind, all these companies are publicly traded. You know, they're not just making movies because they love it. They're a business, you know? And so I can see someone sitting down and saying, like, look, I'm making this movie for this amount of dollars. If I put this white actor in it, statistically, there is a very reliable chance that he or she will earn this much money at the box office. I mean, they're financial models that it's all based off that. The star system is all based off of financial models. If you throw, you know, Owen Wilson in a movie, you're going to make this much money. If you throw this guy in a movie, you're going to throw that much money. And so when you're casting a film, who you get in the film, the budget of your film wasn't determined by the subject matter. It's determined by who you get in it, you know. Mm-hmm. And Ridley Scott, you know, he put it very bluntly, but I feel like he's not wrong. And so the interesting challenge there is, given the reality of a financier being scared or having no reliable financial model for casting an actor of color or of anything besides just a white dude, you know, how do you change that? You know, that's, I think, the big question.
I don't disagree at all. In fact, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, and I would want to add that Ridley Scott has demonstrated his commitment and objectivity to our issue more than once. So I would want to give him credit for that, and I think his words came off much crasser than I think he probably intended them.
Can you cite like the examples? Because I know you were talking about a couple of projects that he's.
Well, I guess I don't want to forget this thought. So let me. The financing or profit issue is there no matter what, and it isn't really about, can I cast a white guy so I can make more money? It's really, frankly, it's a list of box office predictions based on an actor's name and what he's done over the years, and that's how it works. Now, it can work in reverse. You know, Annie is a film that is coming out, and I don't even know if it's out yet. That's a classic film. It's been done, I think, 2 other times, maybe 3. And the main character, the billionaire, or the billionaire in the movie, is now specifically cast with an African American to reflect the progressive nature of this story. And it was done so deliberately. And the African American story, if you will, has evolved to where that is predicted to make more money for this property than replaying it the way it was done before. Now, if there was a bias against African American actors, or that was pervasive, that wouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. But clearly, the almighty dollar is predicting that African American will be embraced in that role, and so it's happened, and it's delightful to see that, and I was very happy when I heard about it. God willing, that happens for us in some way down the road. I can't think of an actor who is Muslim who can bring that sort of dollar or bring that sort of commitment from a studio yet. I don't think that's bias. I think he just doesn't exist yet. He's not that big of a star yet for that to happen. And hopefully that changes, and hopefully maybe you can discover that person.
It's interesting. It goes to the heart of most of Hollywood's problems. It's all based on the star system. You know, it's the unfortunate reality of like the stars are dictating the material that in many ways gets made. But you know, it is interesting because I'm kind of I don't make $100 million movies. But it's interesting. I think there is a way. It's easy to look at the big Hollywood movie and be like, we got to fix that. But maybe another approach is to say, well, how do you start with other things like maybe a TV show or independent films or other ways to kind of change the conversation? Because I imagine historically that's generally probably the way it started with everyone else's plight. I mean, I don't think civil rights issues were coming up in big Hollywood movies at first. They probably were emerging from other places, and then you kind of seep in from the outside. I feel like Hollywood doesn't necessarily lead as much as it does follow. It's like if everyone else is going this way, well, I'm going to follow the dollar there. Just like you said with Annie, it's just like yeah, we can do this with African Americans, and like that's going to have a big draw. It's like cool, I'll go over there if there's money to be made. Mm-hmm.
Zahra, do you have any thoughts on particularly this issue and to expand on it, like how we could possibly change it? I mean, I know there's been the idea that's floated around a lot in our community is that we need a Muslim Cosby show. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure anyone needs a Cosby show this month.
No, I mean, excuse me.
Yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right. So, I mean, my full disclosure is that I don't work on Hollywood films, right? Mm-hmm. I'm engaging community from the outside, saying how do we mobilize opinions and impact change? And I appreciate the candidness about the way financing drives all of it. And at the same time, that's true for every other industry we're pushing on, right? Whether it's police militarization and surveillance or school privatization or the wars abroad, the dollar drives all of it. And sometimes I worry that when we're talking about it to explain it, which is important, it could be perceived as an excuse. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't want it to be the case because that minimizes our own impact to move the dollar. It also gives people an easy way to walk away from their principles, right? Well, we all have to pay our bills. And this is, I mean, it's true even in the nonprofit industrial complex. We have to pay our bills so we do what our donors want, right? But what are our lines in the sand? Where do we stop? What won't we excuse? And today it may be that we won't excuse blackface, and maybe 10 years from now we won't excuse something else. And it's changing slowly. But we also are a part of this game of what brings in the money.
Yeah.
I think what Zahra's pointing out is so important because therein lies the opportunity for creatives or those who are in the industry. Because what is upsetting to one group is opportunity to find something in there that's truth that hasn't been known or isn't known. And obviously, in the case of Muslims and Islam, there is so much that is misunderstood and unknown about us. But the only way to deliver it is in something creative that touches the heart or the head in such a way that it's remembered and believed. And again, the big screen is the most powerful way to do that. The medium screen in TV is the next, and then of course you get to the small screen. But it's there, and that's where the opportunity is. And frankly, much of Hollywood is really digging and looking for those opportunities. I, as you know, have said many times, I hope it's within our own community that can drive that and create those pieces of material that will change opinions and bring things to light.
Yeah, so then, okay, but then that makes me wonder, where do we start? Because Peter and I were talking about this earlier this week about, again, going back to the Exodus example, and Peter brought up a good point that you don't necessarily want to start with the $100 million film to kind of make your point. But where do you start? Do you start as content creators, throw it on the web, see what happens? Do you start, and I guess I am transitioning kind of into this like collaboration question. Do you start by building the relationships and then, you know, going from there? Like, you know, I really grapple with this because I don't know, is it a multi-lane thing? Is it an organized thing? Is it something that, you know, you kind of have to be like under the radar and then out yourself as a Muslim, you know, at some point? Like, these are real questions because we've seen so many communities struggle with representation. I think, and in our community, I believe from my vantage point as Hollywood liaison, I see that our community has a reluctance to even get involved for religious reasons and for, you know, cultural reasons and all of these things. So I guess I'm asking you, Ahmos specifically, because you are so in it, what are your thoughts on where do we start?
Well, we've already started.
Yeah.
There's no way to know, and I mean that. I don't mean to deflect your question, but there's no way to predict what is going to be that one thing that breaks out and changed the view of society. You know, as an artist or those who work with artists, you want the best work done possibly and as accurate as possible, and will entertain. You can't lose the fundamentals of what you do if you're in the entertainment business. So find opportunity to where it'll go. Don't lose sight of your own agenda in terms of what you want told, what story you want told. Authenticity is the key term to stick with all you pursue in Hollywood. If it's authentic to your art, authentic to your story, authentic to the group that we're talking about, that you want representation, it'll get there. My father, many years ago when I was a young boy, told me a statement, a one-liner that I've never forgot. You can't hide the sun with your hands. And I always think about that. And I look at the sunlight as Islam. You will not be able to prevent it from being understood and known. And so instead of trying to predict how it's going to happen, do what you do well in Hollywood, and it will get there.
And I completely agree. We work together, so you know I agree with you. But I'm going to push back on just a little bit because I know from experience that we don't always, you know, so for the audience, we get a lot of opportunities to consult on television shows and films, and they're not perfect, you know. So I want you to talk about, and then I want to open it up to, I want to hear from everybody. I want to then now segue into this idea of consulting on projects that are less than perfect. What are the costs? What are the benefits? And what are our red lines? So, yeah.
Well, one could say, you know, what are the costs of consulting on projects that are less than perfect? I mean, inherent in that is, if it's perfect, you don't need our consultation, you don't need our help. I mean, it's doing what we're hoping would happen on screen. So the mere fact that we are involved implies that there are going to be issues that need to be dealt with. And then it's a matter of degrees. Specifically, I mean, are you should I talk about our most recent firestorm, if you will?
Oh, you mean the tyrant question?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, this is a good time for the tyrant question.
So for those who don't know, MPAC was asked to be a part of consulting for Tyrant. And Tyrant is a drama on FX. And what it does is it's a story about a family who are really essentially a family of a dictator who rule in a Mideastern country, all unnamed. And it's very much a mirror of what has happened and what is happening in the Mideast now. The tyrant is patterned after Gaddafi and after, should I say, and after Sisi now? No, not really. But after just different tyrants, if you will, that have ruled in the Mideast. So it's an amalgamation of different countries. So to see that alone was offensive to people, even though it was really a reflection of life. And we were asked to come on board and consult. And we were given the pilot to get involved in. So that's the very first episode that's going to air, and that's the episode that got the show sold to the networks. And we were fortunate enough to see it. We did not hold back in our opinions in our consultation, and we hacked it up. And we had problems, a lot of problems with it. The producer pretty much took, I can't really think of anything he didn't take in terms of his changes to the pilot. He took our advice. And the producer really changed the direction of the show. And he didn't do it to make anyone happy. He did it because he relied on our opinion and our direction. And he saw more jewels in what we gave him than I think what he originally thought. And that's a credit to him. Now, this producer is such a successful producer that the network's going to buy from him whatever he wants to sell. And it was a great opportunity for us then to get involved. Now, the cost to us was this show had so many elements about it that from just a society standpoint are very distasteful. You know, it's very, the language is crude, the sexual conversation, issues. I mean, it's hard to imagine it's not, that it's even on TV, free TV. That wasn't our area. We weren't involved in that. We could have theoretically said, well, we don't like the fact that you're doing this in your script and that in your script, which is a reflection of life also. We would have lost the opportunity to put things in the script or to get things changed if we took that position. So the cost being we had to bear, having an association with some of those stories, even though they're not our stories. But at the same time, we had the opportunity to affect what is on screen that all the world can see about Muslims, and in this case, about Arabs. And the cost benefit to me is not even, I don't even consider it a cost relative to the benefit that we got. And I can even go as further to say, next year, people will be very happy at the result. And we were flat out told, our involvement affected that direction. And inshallah, that continues and it plays out. But I think most people in this room will be delighted at some of that. Again, the producer thinks these are the best stories to tell. That's his prerogative. The networks like it, and they're moving forward. Surprisingly, many Muslims were very unhappy with our involvement. They were just very, very disappointed that we did it. And they wanted us to take the position of, this is wrong, this has a racist direction, if you will, and we don't want you involved. And all that would have meant for us is, we will be walking away from the table, and on that table, we could affect what millions and millions of people will see on screen. And we just couldn't do that.
I just want to add too, because I was involved in that process, that I think for me, if I could speak briefly on it, it wasn't so much what people were going to see, it's what we prevented people from seeing. Very true. Was the bigger sort of question for me, because that pilot was a doozy. Zahra, can you comment on this?
So I'm thinking of the recently issued Department of Justice racial profiling guidelines, which many organizations, activists, lawyers, so on were involved with, and then really unhappy with the result of, because they didn't get 100% of what they wanted. And I sort of see a parallel, and I'm struggling with how to stay engaged in the content, because I think there is value in impacting what many, many people will see in this show, which I don't watch, but what many people will see. And at the same time, not being seen as putting a stamp of approval on a faulty product.
Yeah.
Because it sounds as though you still describe it as a relatively faulty product, or at least one that is not entirely beneficial for our community, better than what it was originally, and I could never know because I didn't see how much of a doozy that the original pilot was. But I worry that entire instance in the Muslim community was seen as some Muslims have given their stamp of approval to this content. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely not a nuanced perspective. And unfortunately, when people are reviewing these things or sort of looking back at what happened and who the players were, the nuance doesn't come through. And I can appreciate the nuance, but I wonder how we do that in our marketing, because it's another way of holding the folks we're consulting for also accountable. Like, we appreciate that you took our input, and people have said that about the racial profiling guidelines, but we're unhappy with the end result. We want to continue to push you harder. People are unhappy. Like, your viewers feel like this has a negative impact. And I don't doubt that all of those things are being said, but I worry that if they're only said behind closed doors, then that limits the accountability.
Well, that, I think you're getting to the crux of the question. You've nailed it on the head. It's like the problem that we face at MPAC, whether it's with our Hollywood work or our policy work, it's that if you're civically engaged, if you're collaborating, is that an endorsement? And that really, like, you know, for us, we're clear that it's not. Because we've dedicated ourselves to this approach, and this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to talk to everybody, whether we agree with them or not, and see if we can move the needle. But like you said, communicating that to our constituents, our community is the challenge.
I want to also make sure that we always keep in mind a very broad perspective on civic engagement, because it's not just being at the table or in the photo or, you know, doing the consulting. It's also the folks on the outside who are protesting that then make the people at the table seem a little more reasonable. And so there's always going to be those different perspectives. And so to only see one as civic engagement, I think sometimes strikes me as problematic. And that's true for both ends of it, right? So the folks outside should see the folks inside as adding value, but the folks inside have to absolutely see the folks outside as adding value as well. Absolutely, 100%.
Can I comment, Deana, on one thing? One thing that I think unfortunately happens, and this tyrant is an example of it, is when you say the product was somewhat faulty, I guess I would want to make sure and clarify that I am not saying that, and it wasn't that it was faulty. It's unfortunately real. There are issues in it there are things I don't want my kids watching necessarily, but it's real, and sometimes I think people forget they don't want to have to see something that is unpleasant or have to read about it, even though it's true. And that is something that I think MPAC has very much acknowledged, that, and I don't mean to imply that you don't. I just want to make sure it's important that everyone look within when they're making some judgment of, you know, why is this happening? Well, is it true or not, first of all? And one thing that the Hollywood Bureau is very clear about is we aren't here to help someone provide a sterilized view of something. We're here to try and push forward an authentic reflection of something, and that's isn't always easy to do.
Well, yeah,
I can speak to that to some degree, having
perfect
been on the other side of this. You know, so when I was getting ready to do this movie, Camp Exterior about Guantanamo Bay, it was a very low budget film, a lot of very thorny issues in there.
Can you speak a little bit about the film for
sure. Camp Exterior, it's basically a story about a female guard and a detainee in Guantanamo Bay. Kristen Stewart is the guard, and this Iranian actor Payman Mahdi is the detainee. And the film very much is just about these two characters. It could almost be a play, and it's just about over the course of the time. It just charts the very kind of strange relationship a detainee and a guard would have down there. And of course, at the end, the point of the film is that each one of them kind of develops some sort of empathy for the other. The whole theme of the film is to see yourself in someone else is kind of the basic approach to the film. So it's a very humanist thing. But I remember when when we called MPAC, and I was a little scared, to be honest. I'm just like, oh man, are they gonna am I gonna get attacked here? Which goes to, I think, one of the large, and thankfully it wasn't. They were very open, and because that's the weird thing. If you're making this piece of art, you don't want someone in there just being like, how dare you, get out of here, this is outrageous. And so there's a fear to not even want to invite that in, because you don't want somebody, you don't want a bull crashing around in the china shop. But that speaks to, I think, a more interesting challenge with any kind of advocacy work is, how do you approach someone who has a different perspective than you? And that can easily, and my movie is about this, which I've thought about a lot, that can easily turn antagonistic to the point where it's like, oh, I switched off because you're attacking me, so I don't want to be attacked, so I'm going to stop listening to you, as opposed to, some other way where you can approach someone and say, look, I don't like what you're doing, but let's talk about it. Let's try and find some kind of common ground. And it's a problem that's not unique to MPAC or to Muslims or anyone. It's any kind of advocacy. It's always that challenge of how do you approach someone and say, I don't like your point of view, without just getting, because the second you come at someone and you say, you're wrong, then they get defensive, and then the wall goes up between two people. You see this with Republicans and Democrats. You see it everywhere. That's what I always think about in these situations, and I don't know what the answer is, but to me that's always the problem, is how do you advocate without making someone feel like, they're a bad guy, because then they won't listen to you.
No, that's a really good point. And it reminds me of another controversy that we dealt with as a community earlier this year with a problematic show that was announced, that was never aired, called Alice in Arabia. The premise of the show was that a American girl, her parents get into a terrible car accident. They both fall into a coma. The girl happens to be half Saudi. Her wealthy Saudi grandfather flies in to the States and takes her back to Saudi Arabia while her parents are recovering, and only to find out when she gets to Saudi Arabia that she's been locked in the Saudi compound, and she has to wear the hijab, and the other oppressed women in the compound are now helping her escape back to America. So that's very loaded, right? And when we heard about that story, it was actually a really great opportunity for us to collaborate with CAIR, and I believe Yasmin Noha's in the audience, and the ADC. And we were in conversation with the network about the show, and we'd put pressure on the network, and we were telling them, we need to sit down and talk with you about this show. I want to turn to Zahra, because what actually happened was social media played a huge role in the direction that this show went in, which I found fascinating, because it was like the Muslim community mobilized on social media and brought a lot of attention to the show, to the point where the show was then canceled. I have some, we can get into, I have a follow-up thing that I want to talk about with Alice in Arabia, but I do want to talk about the social media aspect of this show and what you're talking about with civic engagement, because that is very much also a form of civic engagement. I want you to talk about the power of that. I know you were involved in that, and what you were feeling from the community on social media about their sentiments and frustrations, and how that was channeled.
So quite often, a thing that people who are frustrated with the media, who are not maybe participating in Hollywood, will say is, if someone were to say this or show this about XYZ community, that would be unacceptable. They would get fired. The show would get canceled. why don't we have that power? And I think Alice in Arabia and the news of it came at a time when those sentiments were already high. It was sort of, the perfect storm, and people flexed their muscle. And this is why I'm a huge believer in not letting producers or studios or anyone off the hook by saying it's just about the money. But at the same time, we also can't let our community off the hook by saying, well, Hollywood is driven by money, right? That we saw that people moved quickly. They weren't, being in one of the organizations that was working around those conversations, I think it's also fair to say that the community said the organizations aren't moving fast enough. That the response that the organization's work elicits is not strong enough, right? That we are fed up and we want something that sends a really strong message. And they got that. And this, taking a step back also, this fascinates me because I think 20 years ago, if we were to talk to American Muslim youth about engaging the media, about amplifying their voices, they didn't have Twitter to do that through. Yeah. Today, someone with the ability to write snarky, short sentences can reach a lot more people than some of the American Muslim institutions, some of the tiny cable TV shows at times. And so that's something to keep in mind when we want to leverage all of the power that our community has.
Yeah. Well, but see, this is why, so this is fascinating to me because I'm sitting here feeling like I'm right in the middle of these two perspectives. On one hand, I was cheering on Twitter, yeah, that was awesome, super clever, it was funny, it was witty, it was all of those things. On the other hand, I'm hearing what Peter is saying about the real fear of then engaging our community, approaching our community. Because the feedback that we got from ABC was that we sabotaged, for better or for worse, we sabotaged as a community the Muslim artists' chance of getting a story about Muslims made that they do like. Because now we've sort of scared off the powerful executives and they don't want to touch a Muslim story with a 10-foot pole. And that's the challenge that we at MPAC find ourselves in every day, because we want to be approachable, we want to be inviting, and we want to have that attitude. At the same time, we don't want to be slapped in the face, So I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. If anybody wants to comment.
You're probably going to hate me for this, but when I hear that log line for that pitch, if that show were done right, I would watch it. I think that sounds fascinating because I would love to see. I could relate to the experiences of a white girl in the Middle East. What's that like? If she has to go back, or whatever, a half race, someone born in America has to go live in Saudi Arabia. That's fascinating to me. Obviously that can be done terribly wrong, but it could be done really right. I think it would be interesting. And so there is the real challenge. We talked about the Cosby Show thing earlier, Bill Cosby notwithstanding. It's a very valid thing because I think a part of moving the needle, as you said, is just exposure. It's familiarity, And the other thing I've been thinking about a lot as we're talking about this up here is something that anytime you kind of start to introduce America at large to a kind of new idea or something that's not part of the mainstream, all right, here's a white male story, get it. I think the first stories that are always going to come out are going to be the most bombastic ones. You know what I mean? So for instance, the very first time, you'd started having Sidney Poitier in a role, race was a part of it. It was about race, or it was about some, large bombastic thing about that. And I feel like that's just part of the way the general world is going to digest these things is, all right, the first time if we're going to do a show that's all about people from the Arabic world, okay, well then, naturally, you're going to glom on to the most bombastic story you can find. So it's oh, what's this, a tyrant? Yeah, that's bombastic. But then, hopefully, over the time, you would get through those bombastic stories, and then it gets a little more familiar. Then it's just hey, guess what? I can put a Muslim on TV, and it's not even a thing anymore. Yeah. But I don't know. I feel generally, that kind of happens with a lot of things. The first time, you talk about, for instance, Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, it's not just about being gay, it's about age, it's oh, it's going to go straight to that, So I don't know, I think that's just kind of the nature of the viewership. You're going to start with the big bombastic stuff and then hopefully level out into the more normal stuff. But that being said, it's it's still a challenge.
You just keep making my transitions for me because I'm about to move into questions, and because we have about 15 more minutes, so I want to make sure we have a nice stack of questions. The question that I have is addressing tyrant, and it's to Ahmos. It says, in response to Ahmos saying tyrant is real, no one was arguing that. The problem is, does it continue stereotypes? Does it support stereotypes? Stereotypes are usually based on truth, but it is one truth generalized to a whole people. Do you think tyrant does that?
Tyrant, in its first season, was very narrow in its focus, which is establishing what this family is about. So in some respects, if people turned it on, watched one episode and turned it off, it probably supported still stereotypes that if they had them, they still have them. If they continued to watch it, then they would start being pulled on some of those stereotypes. They would start to feel that maybe some of those stereotypes are wrong. Then next season, it would carry over to where they would start to see a lot of what they thought were stereotypes were now wrong. And they would hopefully happen in such a way that their heart has been touched, so then they will believe it even more. That's the reality with Tyrant. Now, someone like Howard Gordon, who's doing Tyrant, has the luxury of saying, I'm going to look at this show over a 3-season period, and he can make it happen that way. Whereas Alice in Arabia, if they happen to say, all right, we're going to keep it on the air, and how do you think we should do it? They're not going to do that. She's a first-time writer, and they're like, okay, well, it's not going to work, and it's gone. So there are different economic reasons why that can be. So again, we have in Tyrant, you have a producer who's willing to go after those stereotypes. So I guess it requires patience to be able to say, okay, a show like this can ultimately make some change, even though there are some stereotypes that are there.
Okay, so the next question is to the institutions, MPAC and CAIR. The question is, do MPAC and CAIR have the resources, the talent, and funds to address movie production in Hollywood? Should a new entity be formed that simply focuses on that one issue? And then I also want to add there was another similar question about, the writer puts, the elephant in the room is that we don't have talented Muslim actors or directors. So I see these as related. The question should be, what can we do about it? So they seem to both be talking about institution building around this particular issue, and if that is something that MPAC and CAIR should be in charge of.
Sure. As a producer in the industry, that is a goal of mine. Is to, if I could be running an operation or studio, if you will, or production house that is ultimately pushing the authenticity of these stories, and that covers it well, not sterilized but real. That would be a dream, and I look to do that someday. And I, pray that MPAC would be part of that, and I would expect MPAC to be part of that. Frankly, everything over the last 5 years that I was involved with MPAC would be driving what I would do. Mm-hmm. So, are the resources there today for that? No. Is there enough interest in the Muslim community to participate in that sort of thing? I don't know yet. I hope there is. It's not something that should be done solely in a charitable way. In other words, it's not, I'm going to give to institutions and they can help dictate what happens in Hollywood. That can happen and make a huge difference, but it can't happen in a way that we will only drive our own stories. To drive our own stories requires capital and talent to do so, and the talent is absolutely there. It just requires the commitment to get it on screen.
Zahra, did you want to comment?
I am not going to provide an opinion on whether another competing Muslim alphabet soup organization should be created. I will say that if you ever ask a nonprofit executive director if there are enough resources, they will tell you no. That is why there are executive directors at these organizations. That is why there are fundraising dinners at these organizations. But in addition to resources, I agree with Ahmos that there is talent. It needs to be cultivated. It needs to be developed. And that's why I think that the youth leadership programs that so many of our organizations in the mosques do are so important. I've dated myself once already by saying that 20 years ago there was no talk of Twitter. There was also a lot of talk of dissuading young people from pursuing careers in Hollywood, from pursuing journalism as a career at all. And that's, a little bit separate from Hollywood, but parallel. And I see that slowly shifting. So I would agree. I don't think that there's a shortage of talent. I think that we need to push our young people, our middle-aged people, our senior and well-seasoned people to be more engaged in Hollywood, whether that's getting on Twitter and urging the cancellation of Alice in Arabia or attending a writing workshop somewhere so that they can further their own voice in this other venue that allows more and more people to hear them.
I have a lot of really great questions in front of me and not a lot of time to ask them, so I'm trying to figure out a way to I think the summary of the questions I have in front of me can be summed up in what's next. And I think I want to ask this question by asking, what do you think this conversation is going to sound like in 5 years from now?
I want to chime in on what y'all said. It's kind of an interesting thought is, we've talked a lot about like how do we rail against the studios or like get someone to change what they're doing, but it's an interesting idea to try and generate something on your own and be like, why don't we just, create a little more outreach so we can create a competing thing that generates truth. That's kind of interesting, like a development of fun or something. That's a very smart idea. What I think, and this is just my perspective, I feel like the trend of where everything is going, which is not political, I'm just like staring at the way the world is going, I feel like it's just heading more towards familiarization. And that happens culturally. It's why we're talking about movies here. And you've seen it happen with every culture. Like there are fewer and the world gets smaller and smaller every day. There are fewer and fewer cultures that are opaque to mainstream America, And right now the Middle East or Islam is still kind of opaque, I feel like. But over time, I feel like that's one of the last ones that's going to fall. If you think about it, it happens in all these sorts of different ways. Personally, I think Middle Eastern food is going to drive that thing. If you look at these things, are all driven that way. The same way that Cosby, it's like put a normal like African-American guy on TV, cool, that starts to change thing. Or then it's like, Hispanic, that's like, okay, it's a different world, but then all of a sudden Taco Bell exists, and it's just like, oh, cool, it's very normal. And it sounds cheesy, but it's weird, like it is those very simple things that in a weird way start to make people understand that like, hey, this is just a very normal thing. This person is just like me, so I can start to, when I see them in day-to-day life, it's like, oh, cool, there's an Arabic Muslim on a movie poster. That's not strange to me. I can go see that movie. So
I think, God willing, in 5 years, this conversation will look much more about maybe, I don't know, addressing the quality of something and how well it did something. And in the end, it's going to come down to the mirror that we're looking into. Because as everything percolates to the top and which is ultimately leading more things on screen, we will be faced with our own realities on screen. And which we are today, but it's in such a hectic, sporadic way and unpredictable, and in things that have nothing to do with really us, if you will. So in 5 years from now, I believe the truth will rise to the top, and that will then create this sort of clarity in our own group. I mean, I don't want to use the word ummah really, but in our own group, and that doesn't only involve Muslims. It involves those who aren't Muslim who understand the reality of it. And I really believe it's moving in that direction. And again, it goes back to you can't hide the sun with your hands. It's going to be there, and in 5 years, it's going to move a lot faster.
Thank you.
In terms of getting us to that picture 5 years from now. I'd say that there's a few steps that I would hope that people would take away. And one of them is collaboration across communities. We started with saying that this is not just a Muslim problem, that this impacts so many other communities. One of the shows that came to mind for me that was canceled, I think just within the last couple of years, finally was Cops. After so much conversation about the negative perceptions that was putting forward. And that took community mobilization. So solidarity across communities. Mobilization both through our institutions as well as the individuals inside and outside our institutions to really flex that muscle, right? To really get on Twitter or wherever it may be and say, look, like there are lines in the sand and we will collaborate with you until a certain point, but we also will stop you, or we will, make it necessary for you to stop. And then I think the third is continuing accountability and nuance. It's important that those of us that are doing this work are held accountable by our constituents who will say, we do or don't like the message you're putting out there. We do or don't like this endorsement or this consultation or the output, because that makes our work as activists better, but it also makes the end product better. And hopefully that also circles back then to the folks in Hollywood that are being worked with, so that they understand that it's not just one good show or one real show or one authentic show that lets them off the hook, that people are continuing to pay attention. And I think the last step is something that I also said earlier is young people, is that we do need more people pursuing careers in these sectors. And without that, if we're sort of all just activists, armchair activists, if we're not doing that.
Yeah. Well, I very much value this conversation, and I hope the audience got something out of it. I think for me, what stands out is that we all ultimately want the same things, and we are all coming from very different lenses, and so our approaches are naturally going to be different. I think the key, Zahra nailed it on the head, is that we have to continue to have conversations about this. And the reason why we brought this to the table to you guys is because this was something we were genuinely grappling with all year. This question of, okay, how do we best affect change in this industry that has no rules? There's no guidelines. We're fairly new in our involvement, even though as Ahmos, people like Ahmos have been around and involved in the industry for dozens of years, but organizationally, it's new to us. So in this conversation, I cheated and brought a whole panel of experts so that they can teach me how to do my job. So I very much appreciate the time that we spent together, and I want to ask the audience to thank our panelists.